Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is cold. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. We're just not being a third-rate economy. A banana republic. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to our live recording of Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast where we explain big economic issues in plain English. Can I get a round of applause for our panel tonight before we start? I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I want to begin by acknowledging that we're recording tonight and broadcasting from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So it's very exciting for us here tonight. This is the first time we've done a live recording of Follow the Money. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We had one of our panel members, Audrey Quick, couldn't make it because she was ill, and I know COVID is definitely doing the round. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We're really excited about tonight's event. So basically, as you all know, we've got a new government and a new parliament. And before that new parliament begins sitting, we thought it would be good to talk about the opportunities and challenges the parliament and the Labor government will be tackling across a whole range of public policy issues: international and security affairs, climate and energy, and democracy and accountability are some of the programs that we run at the Australia Institute. And there's a huge number of issues already to get stuck into there. As you will well know, the Albanese government has been very busy since taking office. The Prime Minister and many other ministers have been on a bit of an international charm offensive to mend fences with allies and other countries that have deteriorated, and other relationships that have deteriorated. At home, Minister for Climate Change Chris Bowen has made it clear that legislating Labor's 43% emissions reduction target will be a priority in the first sitting weeks of the new parliament. The Attorney General has been busy as well, dropping the prosecution against Bernard Collaery and announcing a review of the AAT. So we'll get stuck into that, all that and more. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce our panel tonight. Allan Behm is head of our International and Security Affairs program. Sumithri Venketasubramanian is one of our Kantor fellows, our fabulous Kantor fellows. I think there's a few others in the audience here tonight working in our climate and energy program. And Bill Browne is the head of our democracy and accountability program. A round of applause for our panel tonight, please. And I think special thanks to Sumithri, who's filling in very much at the last minute. So we very much appreciate that. Allan, I want to start with you. The Prime Minister, as I said, has been very busy internationally, as well as a lot of his ministers. He's not the only one been attending important forums and things like that. What are some of the key outcomes that people should know about from this charm offensive they've been on and the various meetings they've been to?
Well, Ebony, it's charm offensive is your word, and I think it is completely accurate. Because God only knows, for the last decade or so, we've been pretty charmless. And it was about time, I think, that a government did something about our position and our image internationally. And boy, didn't they start quickly. Penny Wong was out of the blocks very early to go to the Solomons and Fiji and try to do something about restabilising the Pacific. The Prime Minister was straight off to Japan for a meeting of the Quad. Claire O'Neill went to Sri Lanka because we'd had some refugee issues just in the lead up to the election. Tanya Plibersek went to the Oceans Conference in Lisbon. Then Penny Wong went to Indonesia with the Prime Minister. She went then on to Malaysia and went to her hometown, which I think was a really significant thing for her to do, and something which people in Asia really understand, because that's what you do if you come from a hometown, you go back there. And I think the resonance of that was really immediate in Malaysia and in Singapore. Richard Marles went to Singapore, then he went to India, and he's right now in the United States. So that's a pretty active sort of first 6-7 weeks for a new government, and all of it very necessary. I think the most important of those meetings, apart from the early step into the Pacific by Penny, was the Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia. I think that was an incredibly important visit. It's a country that we have neglected very seriously. And I think the Prime Minister's visit to Madrid was also a very significant visit, not least of all because of a stunning change in strategic policy on the part of the Europeans and particularly NATO. Any of you who've had a look at NATO's new strategic concept would have been, I think, really surprised, as I was, to find that there was a paragraph dedicated to China, which says that China is a threat to their interests, to their security and to their values. And I understand that to mean that the Europeans have given recognition to the arrival of China as a global power and have recognised that global power as a threat to them. I think that's really significant, and the Prime Minister was in the midst of that. So I think that sort of to sum it, and the Prime Minister's right now in the Pacific Islands Forum meeting. So I think with all of that, it means that we have a government which is seeking to reposition Australia as a country with some significant agency that is capable of making a change, of contributing to prosperity and the betterment of the conditions of the people in the world, but particularly in our part of the world. And I think it's sort of just to sort of finally sum that up, it's a recognition that a country such as Australia, which has really very considerable power, is at last in a position to accept that it has that power and that it is prepared to exercise that power, not only to its own benefit, but to the benefit of its neighbours.
We'll come back to some of those things that you've mentioned, but Sumithri, I want to come to you next. Allan's been talking about all the international travel, and climate change was such a huge part of that. The government kind of really announcing, I guess, that, you know, there's been a change of government and we do take climate change seriously. Australia's got a pretty poor reputation internationally when it comes to climate change. How is the new Labor government going about fixing that?
So, you know, if you think about Australia's international reputation on climate, you know, just think back to the end of last year at COP26, the UN climate conference, and how Australia was there spruiking fossil fuels, you know, so it's clear that there's tons of room for improvement for what Australia can do on the international front. And one thing is that, you know, Labor's bid to host a COP climate conference in the next 2 years, that will create lots of opportunity for climate diplomacy, for collaboration, and if they're going to host it with the Pacific, in partnership with Pacific Island nations, that's going to, you know, really reinforce that we care about these relationships, that we're taking seriously this issue that is a massive threat and of massive importance to these countries in our region. But it's not just about saying, you know, the things that we're going to do. It's also about having real policy at a domestic level and an international level to show that Australia is changing our direction and is really taking strong action on climate. You know, for example, in 2019, Australia stopped contributing to the UN's Green Climate Fund. So that's a fund which finances programs for emissions reduction and climate resilience in developing countries. So recommitting to the Green Climate Fund is a way of, you know, showing our commitment to climate action. So I think that there's lots of opportunity. And because in a way, Australia is kind of starting from zero, right? We've got such a bad reputation. Really, there's so much that we can do. And I think there's a real opportunity here to flip it from us being in a really terrible position where everyone looks at us like we're a loser to being a leader on an international scale on climate.
Yeah, it's pretty rough to be in the company of kind of Russia and Saudi Arabia when it comes to the climate. climate front. Bill, I'll come to you next. The Australia Institute really branded the 22 federal election as the integrity election. We've seen integrity issues really come to the fore quite a lot. But I did want to start with the decision of the Attorney General to drop the prosecution against Bernard Collaery. That's been an ongoing and kind of shameful episode. How important is it for the Attorney General to have made that decision, and what are the implications for other whistleblowers?
Yeah, thank you. It feels like there has been a weight lifted with that prosecution coming to an end. And I hope it's not the end of the truth-telling around what's happened with Timor-Leste and our relationship there. But it's not the only whistleblower prosecution that's been going on. There are cases regarding the alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, the Afghan files, as well as reports about the ATO being overzealous in its pursuit of small and medium businesses. And those prosecutions are ongoing and represent years or decades of potential imprisonment for the whistleblowers involved. The law itself, in terms of law reform, there's been promising noises from the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus. So he was responsible for the Public Interest Disclosure Act back in 2013. And he's been very open about its limitations. A review in 2016 went mostly neglected under the coalition government, and it's been revisited by the Labor Party. The laws have been described by the courts as obtuse even to lawyers, which is not kind of the position you want to be in if you're a public servant who's made a report internally and you're not sure now what your options are in terms of going public or going privately but outside of your organization, outside of your approved reporting process. So you can fall afoul of the laws for passing on information to a member of parliament, for example. So as much as they can to clean up those laws, as well as reconsider the other prosecutions, I think would help with this growing openness.
Yeah, it's really outrageous that they're prosecuted essentially for revealing government wrongdoing. And I know there's a lot of people in Canberra who've been very staunch supporters of both Witness K and Bernard Collaery, and I'm sure there's huge relief from Bernard Collaery and his team at the moment. Allan, I want to come back to you. Part of Anthony Albanese's trip overseas was visiting the NATO summit. He also visited Ukraine. Fair to say there's a fair bit happening over there at the moment on that front. I know you've talked a little bit about the changes in direction for NATO at NATO. Can you tell us a little bit more about those significant changes and how they impact Australia's interests?
Yes, well, the recognition of China as a global power is obviously very significant for NATO, but more significant for NATO at the moment is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That has done something which I shouldn't have thought Putin really wanted to happen, and that was that NATO coalesced once again. It came together very, very quickly because of the implications of the attack on Ukraine. And many in the audience might remember that only 3 years ago, President Macron described NATO as brain dead. And Putin has managed to effect the first brain transplant in history, I think. That originally was my line, by the way, but I know that Narelli used it on Insiders the week before, the Sunday before last. But that's a very significant thing to happen, to strengthen the spirit and the resolve of NATO. But not only to do that, but to persuade two previously neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, that their security was better guaranteed by membership of NATO than by remaining independent. And for a country like Finland, that is a very, very big step because they share a border with Russia and they know what fighting against Russia is like because that's how, for them, the Second World War began. So the Ukraine episode has been very significant for NATO. Of course, it's been most significant for Ukraine. It is a war of very considerable destruction. It has smashed the Ukraine economy. The people are proving, for the time being, to be very resilient and to take the war right up to the Russians. Nonetheless, it looks as though it's going to settle into a rather long engagement and possibly one of quite serious attrition. And at the same time, Russia hasn't won anything. I mean, it's occupied the Donbass and Luhansk areas, but it really didn't meet the walkover that it actually thought it was going to. So the whole thing for Russia has been a disaster, I think. It has been a disaster for Ukraine, but Ukraine's not isolated. And it's allowed, I think, one final thing to happen, which is for America to restore something of the strategic credibility that it so evidently lost during the Trump presidency. So altogether, a pretty significant event.
Yeah, lots to unpack there. Sumithri, I want to come back to you. We've talked about what's happening internationally, but domestically, Labor's also seeing a bit of a baptism by fire here. We've got, within the first few months of them coming to power, devastating floods on the east coast of Australia, an energy crisis, a crisis in our national electricity market, although long-term listeners will know it's not a gas crisis, it's a gas export crisis, as we've talked about before. But what does this mean for Labor, and how has it approached it in the early days of its government?
So I think that, you know, what these crises mean is that people in Australia are living through the current impacts of, you know, policy decisions, of a lack of action on climate, you know, of decisions that have been made on how we navigate, you know, energy policy in Australia. So this is not something that, you know, we can think about, you know, we'll deal with this in 10 years, we'll deal with this in the future. Like, this is here now. We're not going to deal with it in, you know, 2050, for example. And I think that there is a real, like, opportunity here to really rethink how we're approaching things like the energy sector in Australia. You know, as you were mentioning, this is not an issue with supply of gas or anything. This is an issue with exports, because what's happening here is that Australia has lots of, you know, gas supply, and what we're doing is we're exporting it. Australia is the leading exporter of coal and gas in the world. And what happens is that locally, domestically, we're competing on the international market for our resources, and that drives prices up. But addressing this could, you know, Australians could have cleaner, cheaper, more reliable energy and electricity if we transition to renewables. Because right now we are subsidizing our fossil fuel industry. You know, in the year 2020, 2021, in the federal budget, there were $9 billion that went to subsidizing and supporting the fossil fuel industry. If we take that money and we use that to fund a transition to renewable energy, then that will not only address, you know, this energy crisis, but also coincidentally and really conveniently also put us on a path where Australians don't have to worry and be living in fear of floods and fires and not knowing, you know, what the future has for us.
Yeah, because some of those communities, it's the third or fourth time they've flooded this year. A lot of them experienced bushfires in the couple of years before that. So it really is climate impacts that are here with us right now. As you said, it's not 2050.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the Labor government has said that they want, you know, 82% of electricity in Australia to come from renewables. I think that's great. But even if we do put a lot of, you know, money and investment into growing renewables, if we're still doing the fossil fuel thing, then we're still going to have emissions. You know, we're not going to be stopping climate change. Having more renewables without reducing fossil fuels is not going to solve the issue of climate change. What we really need to do is to make a clear shift from fossil fuels to renewables.
Bill, coming back to you on integrity issues, we've seen a recent announcement too. I know the Australia Institute for a long time now has been pushing truth in advertising, political advertising laws. I was saying to our executive director, I have to eat my hat because a couple of years ago he told me he wanted us to start working on this issue. And I just said, yeah, all right, that'll never happen. And here we are with an announcement that it might do. But tell us a little bit about the history of truth in political advertising laws, because it has been, I think, a long time coming. And what is the new parliament kind of looking at? What is Labor proposing to the new parliament?
So truth in political advertising laws in Australia go back to the 1980s when South Australia, with little fanfare, just introduced them. And they kind of ticked along there from 1985 with revisions in 1995, survived Supreme Court challenges on constitutionality. So if we go back to South Australia, they kind of set a model that other reformers have followed, which is that you have provisions for the ability to make a complaint to the Electoral Commissioner if you feel that a political ad is misleading and deceptive to a material extent. So you can't just make a small error. It's got to be something that goes to the heart of the advertising. The Commissioner has the ability to review, and then they can order that to be withdrawn or retracted or both. So ad taken down, but then also you have to explain that you were misleading people. And South Australia kind of survived as an enclave doing things like that for 30 years, with pushes from time to time at the state level or the federal level as well. But I think in recent years, the promising news is there's been this growing momentum for truth in political advertising, but part of the reason for that is because it feels like the misleading advertising has become so much more prevalent, so much harder to combat, and that's kind of necessitated this further push. So recently in 2020, here in the ACT, we got truth in political advertising laws legislated, thanks to a Greens crossbencher, Caroline Lakuta, but with the unanimous support, Labor, Liberal and the Greens all voting in favour.
Unheard of.
Yeah, that's right. And it really helps, I think, with ensuring that these laws endure, that they do have the support of all parties. They haven't been tested in a territory election yet. They came into force last year. But now we've got federal Labor lending its support as well. And that reiterated by Special Minister of State Don Farrell last week. That probably owes as well to Zali Steggall, who's been pushing this with her own private members bill. And she's provided something of a template for how you could do it at the federal level with innovations on the South Australian model, 30 years old at this point. So it's kind of promising. It's more promising than it has been, but it'll go to JSCAM before, which is the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, before it gets legislated.
It's one thing that we've found, the more that we've worked on it, I think people are always shocked, that you can lie. It's perfectly legal to lie in a political ad. So good to see some movement on there. Allan, China is obviously, you've mentioned it a couple of times already. It's certainly, I think, part of the discourse around the PIF at the moment, and its lobbying efforts in the Pacific to date. But I'm also sensing, particularly from some people in the conservative side of politics, a real pushback about the idea of mending any fences with China, about picking up the phone to China. It seems to be that kind of any contact there is suspect. But I know you've been very invested in saying, we've got to invest in diplomacy. And we've seen the Foreign Minister Penny Wong meet with her counterpart on the edge of the G20. How important is that to kind of resetting that relationship, or at least defrosting it?
Well, it's terribly important. The fact is China's here. There's nothing we can do about that. And it is continuing to grow. It's going to be more here than it has been. It is interesting to think, isn't it, that in December this year, it'll be 50 years since we recognised China and established diplomatic relations. 50 years ago, China's economy was smaller than Australia's. So in 2 generations, we have what is arguably the second largest, if it's not the largest economy in the world, and it's going to keep growing. So we've got to get our minds around what that means for us, what it means for us strategically, what it means for us from a national defence point of view, but also, I think, as importantly, what it means for us economically, what it means for us politically and socially. Now, we haven't done that, and the last way you tackle those problems is to go out and start barking at the moon. It just doesn't help. It might make you feel good, but it does nothing for the moon, and it does even less for anyone else who happens to be watching you. So we've had a lot of free advice from the countries of Southeast Asia about how we might more profitably conduct ourselves, and it looks as though we're beginning to listen to that advice. But you're quite right in saying that the echoes of confrontation and dissent continue. The interpretations, for example, put on what are being variously called the 4 demands, or whatever one wants to call the items listed in the Chinese version of what happened between Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese made no demands whatsoever. That a good translation of the communique put out by the Chinese embassy here in Canberra is actually quite positive. It's constructive and quite gentle in its language. And yet you would be forgiven for thinking that the Chinese have dug themselves in and that we should dig ourselves in as well. Those of you who might have seen Richard Marles' conversation with the Bloomberg team after his discussions with the Chinese defence minister would also have noticed a quite sort of clear move in the language of the Deputy Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has retained a fair bit of firmness in his language. He hasn't moved much, but Penny Wong certainly has. It's interesting that she's moved away from the word normalisation because she recognises, as I think most of us do, that we're going to head towards a new normal, not the old one. So she's using a word like stabilisation in the relationship. And I think just yesterday, the junior Foreign Minister, Pat Conroy, said in the Pacific that we're quite happy to cooperate with China in projects that conducted in the Pacific so long as they make sense. So all of the signals are out there that at last a few adults have come to the table and they're making a bit of a difference. It'll take them a little while, I think, to bring the rest of the community along with them. But already, I know from my own discussions with the business community that it's high time for them to stabilise the economic relationship, and they're right behind what the government has started to do.
Yes, I should think there'd be a huge number of Australian producers who'd like to be very much exporting back to China again. Sumithri, the new parliament has effectively a climate supermajority. Climate was a very big issue for not only Greens voters and the election of Greens in particular Brisbane, but obviously all the independent candidates who rang on strong platforms of climate action. We know that Labor is going to be legislating its 43% target when Parliament returns. Just walk me through what some of Labor's, I guess, key climate priorities are and how we think they'll go with the target and other things as Parliament begins with this new kind of push and focus and support for it within the Parliament.
So like you were saying just now, that, you know, climate, people in Australia voted for climate, but not only did they vote for climate, they also voted for integrity. You know, a lot of those independents who ran on a platform of climate were also calling for stronger integrity measures in Australian institutions, and I'm sure that, you know, Bill can speak very well to that. And I think that bringing those two concepts together, climate and integrity, is something that that the new government has recognised as a priority for their policies. So previous Australia Institute research, as well as research by other organisations, has shown that, as an example, the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is Australia's only legislated climate policy, doesn't have integrity. And what that means is that there is the potential where we're paying industry to pollute in the name of reducing emissions. And we're funding things, I guess, false solutions like carbon capture and storage in the name of climate action. And
But it's not actually reducing emissions.
No, which is where this whole idea of integrity comes in, right? Which says that if we're saying that we're reducing emissions, it actually has to happen. And part of the challenges there are that, you know, there's a lack of transparency about how decisions are made, of what methods are approved under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And the government has announced a review of the emissions reduction fund, of the carbon market in Australia, which is really welcome, because what it shows is that the government does not only care about climate, but it also cares about integrity, and it cares about climate integrity. And I think that that's really promising, and I think it's a great first step.
And presumably that should get support from this new parliament as well, from the Greens and Independents as well. Can you talk a little bit about specifically that target, 43%? A lot of Greens and Independents will probably be pushing for greater climate ambition. What's the discourse around that at the moment?
So the target is 43% of reduced emissions over 2005 levels by 2030. So the target at the end of the day is you know, a number that we say that we want to achieve this by this date. I think it would be really great if we go above and beyond. I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience would agree as well that, you know, a target is sort of like the floor. It's the minimum that we want to achieve. There's nothing really stopping the government from doing much more than that. But I think what really matters is that whatever the target is, it is achieved in a way that we're actually reducing emissions to that extent. You know, those false solutions that I mentioned just now, carbon capture and storage, all of that stuff that's unproven, and we don't know that that actually does lead to emissions reduction. And so if in name, you know, we got to 80% emissions reduction, but it was all false solutions, then really it would be much better for us to have a target that we actually do achieve, and that we do meet in a way that represents the strong belief in climate action that not only Labor but the Greens and Independents had been running on for the election.
There's probably a whole nother podcast in the coalition's approach to climate following this election. But Bill, I'll come to you next, and to the AAT now I want to move to. So the Australia Institute had done some research on political appointments to the AAT. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and some of the latest announcements on what might happen there?
Yeah, so the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the AAT, is the subject of one of the biggest studies of cronyism in appointments, perhaps in the world, certainly in Australia, by the Australia Institute. Deb Wilkinson and Liz Morrison worked on that. And what they found is a really stark increase in the share of political appointments to the AAT over time. So starting in 1996, through the Howard and Rudd and Gillard years, about 5 to 6% of appointments to the AAT were political. That goes up to 32% during the coalition government. And then within the Abbott, then Turnbull and Morrison governments, there's also an increasing trend of political appointments. So the AAT, for those not familiar with it, is responsible for merits reviews of certain government decisions. So questions like child support, welfare payments, visas for immigration or for refugees, veterans' entitlements, among many others. So administrative questions, but with the potential to be life and death decisions for you, and the kind of thing that you'd really expect for your case to be heard by someone who is absolutely independent and impartial, as well as highly qualified. You know, AAT decisions are meant to be the legally correct decision. So you really want to have legal expertise in the people who are hearing your case.
And is that, did the political appointments have lots of legal expertise, Bill?
No, there was a stark difference between political appointees with legal qualifications, as well as the duration of legal experience, and those without. And that was true even for senior members. So those are the ones who are supposed to be advising the rest of the membership and providing support there. And there's a stark contrast in the share who have those qualifications from the political appointees. So that report made 10 recommendations for how you could improve the appointment process, have a spill of the AAT to allow fresh appointments that are independent and comply with that process, and locking that into legislation so it can't be rolled back by future government without taking their case to the Parliament first. There's been promising moves from the Attorney General. He's committed to a transparent merit-based process, which includes advertising for the positions publicly so that people can apply.
How novel.
Yeah. As well as leaving the decision-making to be done by a combination of a representative from the AAT, senior public servant, and so on, a committee of 3. He's also conducting a review of the AAT more generally. It doesn't go all the way to the recommendations in the Australia Institute's paper, which includes stricter rules about who can be appointed, as well as a particular appointment process that's laid out, and as I said, locked into legislation so it's secured, and an independent review rather than one happening through a minister. But it's a promising start, and I think suggests that they're taking this seriously, and I hope it's just the beginning.
We might come to questions from the audience now. We've got a microphone up the front here. So if you've got a question for our panel, please come on forward. But Allan, I wondered if I could come back to you while people are thinking of questions. We've seen that the PIF, the Pacific Islands Forum, is underway at the moment. Climate change, obviously a huge security issue for the Pacific. What are you expecting to see out of the PIF?
I think that we will see a further confirmation of a fundamental change in direction by Australia on climate, and a very clear recognition by the Prime Minister and Pat Conroy, while they're there, that the Pacific Island countries are confronting an existential threat, that this is probably the most serious security threat facing the Pacific, not China, and it is probably the most significant security threat facing Australia too, not China. So I think that that's the first thing that will come out of this PIF. I'm hoping too that the sort of intra-PIF squabble that's been going on, it sounds as though they all went to Christmas lunch together and it didn't work all that well. Some people might be familiar with that phenomenon. Anyway, Kiribati and the Cook Islands are at sort of daggers drawn at the moment because of who is going to be the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. That requires a bit of very careful diplomacy, and I'm rather hoping that in the sidelines of this PIF, it can be brought back to be as cohesive and collusive as it previously was, and that particular issue around whether a Micronesian, a Melanesian or a Polynesian is going to be the Secretary General. That will require a bit of care though. And I think that a bit of applied diplomacy by Australia could be really helpful there.
We got a question here.
Thanks very much. It's been a fantastic discussion. I just want to pick up on carbon capture and storage. The International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the International Renewable Energy Agency all say that meeting net zero targets will be virtually impossible without carbon capture and storage, in particular on hard to abate sectors such as cement, and increasingly with things like negative emissions technologies. So I just wanted to ask, why is it that your view of CCS is so at odds with organisations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
Sumithri, do you want to take that first? And Bill, I know you've written some of our reports on CCS in the past.
Sure, thank you for that question. So with carbon capture and storage, at this stage, it's quite a new technology, right? And so we're not entirely sure about, in the long term, what the effects of essentially taking carbon from the atmosphere and injecting it into the ground, whether that will lead to long-term emissions abatement in a way that where we can claim to achieve emissions reduction in long term. It's a very new technology. We're not entirely sure about how it works. I do agree with the point that there are sectors in which it is really hard to abate carbon emissions, whether it's aviation or some production industries. And in those cases, definitely finding ways to make up for the emissions is absolutely crucial. I think that there are other methods which could achieve this, which are less, I suppose, uncertain than carbon capture and storage.
Bill, I think you know a little bit about the uncertainty of carbon capture and storage in the Australian context in particular. What has your research found in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that people say it's going to be hard to achieve our emissions goals without carbon capture and storage, but it feels pretty hard to do it with carbon capture and storage either. So I've reviewed in the Australian context the over $1 billion spent on large-scale carbon capture and storage projects in this country with almost nothing to show for it. And that's in the face of promises from the fossil fuel industry that we were going to have these projects operational, as well as promises that they'd pony up dollar for dollar what the federal government, the taxpayer, was ponying up. And they never came close to it. It really feels like they've lost confidence in carbon capture and storage well before the government has. And I think that's why we have such wariness of it as a technology. I think it's possible that in 2050 it will make a contribution to emissions reductions, but to be focusing on it when we have so many other tools at our disposal now for easy emissions reduction, it would be a big mistake.
And I will just add to that, a new phenomenon that we've seen in Australia is not just carbon capture and storage, but carbon capture use and storage, which is one of the industries that does use it fairly effectively is the oil industry. And they tend to pump it underground just to get extra oil out of mining operations. So that's certainly the road that we're heading down, but not been a huge success in Australia. Does anyone else have any questions for the panel, or I'm more than happy to keep exercising my host's prerogative there to ask more questions. Sumithri, coming back to climate action and where we're headed, I want to come back to the floods again and actual climate impacts. We're seeing now that it's impacting communities as we speak. It's not some future thing that's going to happen. How much are we going to have to address the climate impacts that are here with us now? We've certainly seen the Prime Minister at joint press conferences with the New South Wales Premier announcing, flood relief and support for those communities who are going through that cleanup. But it happens all the time now. These aren't 1 in 100 year floods anymore. How big an issue is this going to be to tackle?
Even if we have really, robust climate action where we are reducing our emissions, we are still going to be seeing the effects of climate change because we already are. Even if we cap our emissions, if we cap global warming, we're still going to be seeing the effects of current climate change. So it's crucially important to think about adaptation and how we can have a plan a national plan for adaptation to the effects of climate change in Australia. We really need to think about this in the long term, to think about what is it that we can expect to see down the line in a way that is coordinated, in a way that we anticipate what might happen, and that rather than focusing so much on recovery after these things, I mean, of course, if something does happen, we definitely want there to be, lots of investment and support for those communities. But if we are able to kind of preempt those disasters, it would be a lot better than putting people, through all of this catastrophe and then having to pick up the pieces. So we really need to be thinking about adaptation. We really need to be thinking about, how can we be one step ahead of the impacts that we're going to be seeing, and how do we do that in a way that's coordinated at a federal level and with all of the state and territory governments as well.
Allan, I know in your past you've worked a lot in the climate space. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, while Sumithri was talking, I was thinking of our colleague Richard Dennis's really lovely and witty op-ed in today's Guardian, that there is actually an old and tried technology for carbon capture and storage, which is trees. And I mean, I think it's very important that we do look at carbon capture and storage systematically right across the board. And certainly, I mean, I was deeply, deeply involved in preparing the legislation for 2011, and we looked very, very closely at whether or not we might even include in our legislation any reference to carbon capture and storage, and decided not to, not least of all because it was then, as I think it is now, an almost totally unproven technology. A lot of money has been spent on it, but for very, very little evident gain. And I think that that's probably what prompted Richard to tell everybody that I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. So I think that as we look at the whole issue of carbon unfold, we've got to look at the biological sciences as offering some extraordinary possibilities, both with respect to how you generate electricity, how you transmit electricity, how you use carbon, how you capture it, how you produce food much more energy efficiently, but also carbon efficiently. So I think that the prospects for real advances in the management of our climate are virtually unlimited, and we should be optimistic about it.
I would like to narrate please come on down. I would like to narrate my own personal encounter with carbon capture and storage. I went to Queensland's premier carbon capture and storage project that I think at the time had about at least $500 million invested in it. And we went to visit it, the site in Queensland in 2007, and it was a paddock. And I think it probably still is. So got a question right here.
Yeah, Allan, I was just wondering, where do you think the, the very sort of aggressively anti-China thing comes from? Is it, I mean, I know ASPI have pushed a lot of that stuff. Is that, do you have thought, because it seems to be, very sort of, I don't know, premeditated and planned kind of and consistent push that doesn't always seem to be based in reality. And I know ASPI are funded by the, to a large extent by the arms industry, and that obviously, want countries to spend more money on, defence, on military hardware and that kind of thing. Is there any connection to the arms industry, do you think, or do you have any other thoughts about where it's coming from?
It's clear that the arms industry have a vested interest in flogging their stuff. And one of the good ways of building your market is to make everybody frightened of somebody else and then acquire all of this military hardware in the off chance that they might have to use it at some stage. But on that, I'm just reminded of that wonderful remark that an unlikely ally, Senator Jim Molan, made last year when sort of ridiculing the idea that Australia might ever find itself in armed conflict against China by saying we'd be lucky to last 3 days. And I must say I took enormous comfort from the fact that with the doubling of our defence vote, we might even last 6. And but I think that your question raises a really important point, and that is that sitting underneath this constant aggression towards China, confrontation with China, are a set of pathologies which I think are very dangerous. The first one, I think, is a pathology around race and racism. I'm absolutely confident that a key driver of the anti-Chinese ideology in Australia, particularly at the moment, goes all the way back to the first gold rushes. And when we saw state governments, or as they were colonial governments at the time, introduce the poll taxes, putting high penalties on Chinese miners who came into Australia, that translated itself in 1903 into an effective White Australia policy, which lasted up until the Whitlam government. So it was very much a key feature of Australia's way of thinking about the world. And I think that continues to reverberate in some parts of the Australian psyche. The second is quite a profound insecurity that I think Australia experiences even now. We see it most in our constant sort of clambering after a great protector. It was Imperial Britain for a long time, and now it's Imperial America. And that's where that bit of it links back into your considerations of ASPI, I think, because the principal arms contributors to the ASPI budget are American companies. And I think the third issue is that Australians generally have absolutely no understanding at all of China and China's culture, that we manufacture a threat from China, where if you even have a cursory understanding of how China actually operates, it doesn't operate by threat. And you'll say, oh, what about the Indian border? They're threatening there. And what about the South China Sea? Yes, there are instances where China will make a claim and stand to defend it. But if you look into the patterns of Chinese behaviour over a very long period of time, like a couple of thousand years, you'll see that that's not really how they operate at all. They demand respect, but they don't collect it by the use of the means of force. Very different from, say, the Roman way of asserting its power and its authority. So for our part, I think those three things, a lack of understanding, isolation, insecurity, and race, combine in a very ugly way in much of the current discourse from the more conservative sides of Australian makeup on the China question.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, everyone. This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 13th of July, and things may have changed since recording. Can I get a round of applause for our panel, please? And thank you all for coming out tonight. We'll see you again next month. We'll have Andrew Lee as our special guest, and make sure that you're subscribed to our mailing list so you can find out when that will be on. I think it's at the end of the month, maybe the 31st. And thank you again for coming out tonight for our very first live recording of Follow the Money. Thanks, everyone. See you next month.